Colleagues, very good afternoon to you. Just to recap, this is one of 4 breakout rooms for the Glasgow dialogue, just so we know that we're on the right place. And may I make a request? This room is pretty large. If you don't mind, could we all come up front so that we can have a more interactive and conducive, intimate discussion on this very important issue. So if you don't mind, please just come up front and if you don't mind. But if you prefer to talk like this, then that's fine. I'm not going to force.
Would you like to move, or people are coming? It's too late. Talking and ask for them.
Okay, may I request the IT support team to flash the questions up, please? Yes, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, colleagues and friends. This is one of 4 breakout groups. If you recall, yesterday we ended the session informing you that there will be 4 breakout groups on 4 different questions. The intention is not for each group to deal with only one question. The intention is that for each group to deal with all 4 questions. As I mentioned yesterday in the closing, I know many of you will have prepared statements, but I would implore you to put those statements aside if you can, and try to really focus on the issue at hand, talk to each other, engage each other on each question. There are some presenters from yesterday, and I believe the IOM is here. Where is IOM? Is IOM here? Or? Okay, IOM is supposed to be here. Maybe they don't like me, but yeah. So try to use this session. We have 3 hours. We have 4 questions. I'm not going to impose a time limit for each question. I suggest, and if you agree, we take 1 question at a time, and then we'll have a discussion and dialogue. And like I said, I hope you do not just use this occasion to express a view, but use this occasion to listen to others, what they say. And then if you do have points of, you do have counterpoints, do let me know. We can then give you the floor again to ask questions from the other person, to provide a different point of view. But I would very much like to have that kind of engagement. So that is my hope. But again, it's a party-driven process, and you do what you have to do. My second hope is, I forget what my second hope is, but my second hope is that you will treat this informally. This is really supposed to be a breakout session, and so we're supposed to have, so take off your jackets if you wish, make yourself comfortable, and try to be more informal in your interactions and discussions. The third point to raise is that I'm supported here by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So she is basically tasked to take down all that is, she will take copious notes of all that is being said. As mentioned in the closing of the plenary of the Glasgow dialogue, we will report back to the Glasgow plenary on Saturday with some of the key issues that have been raised in these sessions on the 4 questions. The Secretariat from across the 4 different rooms will be preparing all this in a consistent way, I suppose, to reflect the discussions as accurately as possible. It is not yet clear to me whether I suppose I will give the report back. But really, just to reiterate again that the program that has been designed for Glasgow Dialogue is a program that have been prepared by the SBI chair under her authority. She did, as she had told me, obtain inputs from the WIM ExCom, particularly with regards to the questions. And so, yes, so she will be organizing and taking a strong hand in terms of what we see and organize on the 3rd day. But my job here really today is to try to facilitate discussions. So I hope you will cooperate with me on that so that we can try to make the most of this session and try to get the best solutions we can find to avert, minimize and address loss and damage, particularly to those who are most vulnerable and those who really need it most. So I think let's keep the eye on the ball. Let's look at these questions with that objective in mind, and let's see what we can do to get a productive discussion today. So I recognize Jamaica, I recognize Mexico. I think that's, for now, we'll have those, but just to be clear, we are going to address the first question again. And the first question is, what are the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change? So with that, I open the floor to Jamaica.
Thanks for opening and
Nice to see you
for
again.
providing those remarks. Just a question, though. It's in relation to what happens today. We do note that you didn't put any time limits on the discussion. So is it that we're spending all the allotted time in breakout groups? Or is there any point later today that we transition to a plenary? Or is the expectation that the plenary and discussion on the way forward will all take place on Saturday? So it was more a point for clarification, not yet to intervene on the question. Thanks.
Thank you. So just to be clear, the whole 3 hours today is dedicated to addressing the 4 questions in this breakout group. So your colleagues or friends will be addressing the same questions in the other breakout group. So we have a lot of time. So my suggestion is maybe we allocate about 40 minutes for each question or maybe half an hour, and then we can try to, if we can wrap it up earlier, I'm not going to hold you back artificially. But maybe let's allocate about 30 to 40 minutes for each question. We'll go through one question at a time. But if some of you want to address all the questions at a go, that's fine. But I prefer, I think, and for the Secretariat, it would be better if we try to focus on each question at a go. And so the plenary will be on Saturday. And then that's where the report back will be held. So each of the breakout groups will then give a gist of what was discussed in each group that day. And then on that day, the plan then is to go into a discussion about the next steps forward. Okay? All right. So Mexico, you have the honor of kicking off the discussion. Thank you so much, Camila, for joining us.
Thank you, Joe. It's an honor. And on the arrangements, yesterday at the Glasgow Dialogue, we heard quite a few examples from the Adaptation Fund, from the GCF, and from UN agencies on various initiatives and various projects that they are funding. But all of them are especially focused on averting And there's more than those that we heard yesterday. I mean, there's crews, there's the regional banks. In Mexico, we have a lot of experience on early warning systems, and we've invested quite a bit, not only in Mexico, but in the Central American region. And so there's a myriad of regional institutions, of different UN agencies working, and one of the things that was for us really helpful to have the Santiago network is, first of all, to have a broad understanding of all of the landscape that we have for averting loss and damage, because there are quite a few facilities, there's quite a few panorama, and we not necessarily know everything that is out there, and that the Santiago network could also help us improve, sort of create those linkages between what is needed, what is out there. Having said that, unfortunately, when we are talking now about addressing loss and damage and the what I mentioned yesterday, the aftermath of natural disasters, or the impacts that we are already experiencing, droughts, desertification. Colombia gave us the numbers yesterday. There's nothing out there for financing those impacts, and that's what we are worried is that usually when a natural disaster impacts a community, I mean, we received humanitarian aid, but that humanitarian aid is only available for a week until there's a bigger news or a bigger scandal or a bigger political I don't know, whatever news is hot at the top, and then all of the humanitarian aid stops flowing. In that sense, we need more than that. We need to build resources to help communities to rebuild and to face those impacts of loss and damage that we are already experiencing, and that, as we heard in the IPCC report, even if we address adaptation and we invest in adaptation, we still know how to sort of deal with the impacts of loss and damage. So there's no financial entity, facility, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing right now out there to make sure that we have sort of a window open for the most vulnerable communities that are being affected by loss and damage, and that's one of the things that it would be important to address going forward, either giving a mandate to one of the existing funds or being innovative, whatever we can think of as parties, but we need to have something for addressing loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. So one suggestion, we need to think about giving a mandate to the funds to address loss and damage. Maybe before I take the next speaker, maybe I just open the floor to any international organization representatives here that may want to address the point raised by Mexico, which is what is out there, what are you doing, which is really the first question. What is out there, what are you doing? We did hear the point about there is the acknowledgement that there is work on averting and minimizing, not enough on addressing. So I see someone pressing the mic. Is that no? So wave your hand, any international organization or even member states who feel that there is work being done on this and you would like to share, just wave your hand so that I can pull you up front. No one. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Switzerland, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to jump the line, but I was going to actually respond to Camilla's question.
No, I think I hope the other speakers don't mind, but I would like to get this conversation going. So the question really is what is out there and what are international organizations doing? Let's get to that particular point. So yes, Switzerland, please.
Yeah, and so I also speak from our national experience. So we make large core contributions to the International Red Cross, and we also have a large humanitarian portfolio, which we also have lots of activities going towards averting and minimizing loss and damage through various, like, as you said, early warning systems and so on. Switzerland does a lot on meteorological work. We work a lot with landlocked countries or mountainous countries because we have a lot of experience on that. Working around addressing the question of landslides, glacier lakes that break, and so on and so forth, based on our own national experience. And we feel that's most effective because we actually can share what we have learned and what has worked and what doesn't work. But then we also have the humanitarian portfolio, which goes towards addressing loss and damage. We don't market as addressing loss and damage as part of our humanitarian portfolio, but maybe that's something we can draw as a lesson learned, that we have to better track what that is and where it goes. And it's good to hear from countries like Mexico or others that you feel that this support is not sustained, it's not there long enough, because in our case, when we work with because we usually, we have humanitarian activities also in countries which are not our focus partner countries. And there maybe the interventions are a bit shorter, I agree, not a week. Our engagement when we go in for humanitarian aid is much longer than a week. It usually really tries to get the country back on track over the crisis mode. But if for partner countries that we work with, and we also have a development cooperation portfolio, there's actually this nexus that we are working more enhanced now, and we just restructured our development cooperation to better address exactly this nexus where it moves from humanitarian aid to development cooperation, so that it's not just crisis mode, but then crisis mode moving into like rebuilding better, right? And then that's also part of our classical development cooperation funding, I guess, and it's not marked as loss and damage finance, but there's quite a large amount going into this. Investing, for example, in hospitals that have been destroyed and so on and so forth. And there we focus, the nexus work, we focus on the countries that we already have a standing partnership, since that helps to also, because you know the local context better, you have long-standing relations and so on. And I guess we have to get better at collectively ensure that all countries are somehow captured in one of these partnerships, you know, that we don't have few countries that get a lot of assistance and then some are left out. I think that's something we have to look into. But I think there's a lot of space out there that's already going on, but maybe it's not seen because it's not labeled like that.
Thank you. Very quickly, anyone would like to respond to Switzerland's point? So maybe I'll try. I have a question. So I take your point about partnerships, that this is focused on your partnerships, but one of the key issues, again, I heard yesterday was how to direct this aid to the most vulnerable. So if the most vulnerable are not part of your partnerships, then how, or what suggestions could you offer? So I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but just for the purpose of if you wish.
I'm happy to respond, but there's others in the room. I mean, in our case, but that goes to the heart of how you understand development cooperation. We have in our portfolio many countries many LDCs. We're not so active with islands. Our global cooperation is. And there we invest in large-scale multilateral funds more. But we know that there's other countries around the table who are more active in partnerships with islands. And I think, yes, we have to address that, right, so that everyone is covered. But what is the most vulnerable? That's a question back. And I think what we also don't want to run into is that there's a perception there shouldn't be development cooperations or humanitarian aid nexus cooperation activities in non-LDC SIDS. I don't think that's what we want to convey. And we have a large LDC portfolio, but we also have countries which are not considered LDCs, but for other reasons. For example, Central Asia, which is very mountainous, it makes sense that we have a lot of cooperation with them, especially in that space. And very happy to hear from others who are engaging in these kind of activities, how they understand this humanitarian development nexus.
Thank you, Switzerland. Okay, Colombia, yes.
Thank you, co-facilitator. Perhaps just to join the discussion on humanitarian assistance and just to give some food for thought and to respond to Switzerland in the sense what we have in humanitarian assistance. Some data that we have is that from 2016 until 2020, the international humanitarian assistance average was 29.6 billion US dollar. And this humanitarian assistance just covers refugee crisis, wars, natural disasters, COVID. It does not cover at scale addressing loss and damage, nor does adaptation finance, where there is a massive adaptation gap. So just to say that in our case, we do not see any kind of support in terms of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, as we mentioned yesterday. Even for averting and minimizing, we have something, which is nothing also for us. Addressing is more than nothing. So just to say that, and just to jump in terms of this humanitarian assistance. And if you allow me, co-facilitator, I just want to say that and nothing such as finance for loss and damage or finance for abating, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage exists with that or a similar name under the Convention and the Paris Agreement financial mechanism. We would like to highlight that we had the opportunity to look at a report, and I would like to invite all of you to look at it, which was developed by the German Watch, and an analysis of potential for loss and damage finance of Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the Least Developing Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund came out with some key findings that I would like to highlight for this discussion. First, the best cover measure is setting up, scaling up, or capacity building for climate risk insurance schemes. The largest gap concerns coverage of measures to address non-economic loss and damage. Third, regarding climate-induced migration, there is a big difference between support measures for planned relocation and those to support displaced persons. Measures that have an adaptive capacity and resilience building element have a high chance of being funded due to the fund's objectives with an adaptation focus. Adaptation Fund, SCCF, and LDCF, or Adaptation Window, the GCF window. And most projects identified did not have an exhaustive focus on the analysis, loss, and damage measures. And the current financing mechanisms and modalities of the UNFCCC funds are not suitable for funding all loss and damage activities analyzed, particularly measures to address loss and damage immediately following an extreme weather events, as well as slow onset processes at an early stage of occurrence. And finally, the loss and damage measures that the UNFCCC already funds all contain a strong element of addressing the residual risk of loss and damage, which is ex ante, through resettlement and climate risk insurance. Conversely, as we mentioned and as we heard yesterday, ex post measures to address actual materialized loss and damage, such as rebuilding of infrastructure and livelihood support for displacement persons, and all measures to address non-economic loss and damage have less potential to receive funding. So in that sense, I just want to support the comments made by Mexico in the sense that we really need to have this kind of facility or financial fund if we want to address and get the action. Of course, this kind of measure should Also take into account the mitigation ambition, the adaptation, because if we don't have mitigation, so we need to move to the adaptation, and then we will move to we have to deal with loss and damage. But I think at this point, the science is there, the documents are there, the information is there, the NGOs are clear, the studies are clear, so we do not have any kind of financial support for loss and damage. So just to reiterate, because for us it's important to highlight that international humanitarian assistance is nothing for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Columbia. You mentioned a report. Could you repeat that report again?
It's German, it's a report by German Watch.
German Watch.
Yeah. Let me check the name just a second. It's potential for loss and damage finance in the existing UNFCCC financial architecture, German Watch 2021. So it's a report that is, it was launched this year, so I would
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Okay, the title is
Yes.
Schaffert et al. I can send it to you by email, but the name of the report is Potential for Loss and Damage Finance in the Existing UNFCCC Financial Architecture, German Watch. It was launched this year, the previous year, 2021. So we would like to invite all of you to look at it. We have different data and different information. This is just one of the reports that we would like to highlight. But it's clear to us that for us that there is no any kind of financial assistance for loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Columbia. So for the rest of us, the report, as mentioned by Columbia, is for your reading pleasure. Next on the list is the U.S.
Great. Thank you so much, and facilitator. I really appreciate the inclusion and trying to get everyone to sit at the table, and just in the spirit of making sure it's easy for voices to be heard and there's more spaces filled. I just wanted to reiterate your invitation for folks to sit at the table, because we're, I think, excited about the dialogue and being able to have constructive conversations with each other. So appreciation for you for inviting folks to please come up and sit. And I just wanted to appreciate the conversation that's been had so far. I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, so have wanted to follow up a bit on the talk about humanitarian assistance, recognizing that there are huge needs that are not being fit in traditional humanitarian assistance, and then also because of the climate crisis. So there's unmet needs everywhere. I want to quickly answer the question on vulnerability and targeting on vulnerability. There's a broader sort of country level looks at vulnerabilities, but when we're doing humanitarian assistance, one of the main priorities is often looking at those most vulnerable that are being most impacted. So you can do vouchers, you can do cash-based assistance that just targets female heads of households, children, elderly, so that you are really getting to those most vulnerable in humanitarian crises, be they floods or what have you. So there's sort of a programmatic side of it. But then when we look at the big macro response, I would respectfully highlight of that 29 billion that was mentioned before, there's, again, that was probably only meeting half the needs that the UN had identified for humanitarian assistance, but a lot of that is responding to natural hazards. So for example, floods in Colombia were responded to and supported by some USAID programming, including for some refugees, but also for some Colombian impacted by floods over the last couple of years. And the direct relation between climate change and some of those natural hazards, there's obvious connections, but there is some response happening. I think, and I really appreciate Switzerland's point, I don't think we're having a vocabulary issue on some aspects of this humanitarian aid. Again, referencing that we're not meeting all needs, but there is assistance going to a lot of different types of humanitarian crises around the world. And it'd be interesting to hear from some of the international organizations that are doing some of those responses, funded by some of the donors around the table, how they see their responses, how are they making sure that they're adding in disaster risk reduction into their work too, because there is a large focus and growing focus on how we can work on averting and engaging with local communities as much as possible to empower them to be able to protect themselves. It's a big priority of the United States government right now to ensure we're empowering local voices. Like we heard yesterday in the session from the IFRC, the localization effort is critically important to make sure we're being as effective as possible in our responses. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, the US. There is assistance going on, more on the humanitarian side. Could we have the contribution of Canada?
Thank you. Oh, I'm too far. Thank you very much, and really great to be in this breakout group setting. I think the presentation yesterday's were very helpful, but I think this is where we're going to have the real discussions. I just want to highlight Canada's vision for the Glasgow dialogue. And we really want to use this time to unpack the issues, understand what is there, what is not there, what needs to be scaled up or improved. And we know there are things out there, but it's scattered, and we agree that we need a more coordinated and coherent approach on loss and damage. As many said, I think loss and damage is a complex issue. There's, of course, humanitarian assistance, development aid, disaster risk reduction, early warning system, and we can look at, I think it's Article 8.4 of the Paris Agreement that highlights areas for cooperation, and that's kind of like where Canada bases its understanding of what is encompassed when we talk about loss and damage. So as we see it, we want to have a better understanding of the broad landscape for loss and damage, and in our mind, it's not just the UNFCCC issues. There's many UN agencies that are involved in the process. There's currently many funding arrangements that exist for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, but they're most of the time focused on one specific area, like I mentioned in some areas on Article 8.4 of the Paris Agreement, and they're not necessarily addressing the full loss and damage spectrum. So in Canada, what we try to do our homework and to get a better understanding of the different streams of funding for loss and damage. Just to give you an example, like I work at the Environment Minister, and we have a part of climate finance, but also our Foreign Affairs Agency as a part of the climate finance, and they do funding for the Sendai framework, funding for humanitarian assistance, development aid, and we don't really have like a really good understanding of what exists in loss and damage because it is scattered across different branches in government. And so we are doing this exercise of trying to map a little bit what is there to try to have an overview of what is loss and damage finance so that we can ultimately identify potential gaps that needs to be addressed. Just want to highlight a few areas that Canada has been active in. It's definitely not exhaustive because I think I have a 36-page table of things we mapped out so far. So Canada has been a member of the high-level consultative group of the Instant Resilience Global Partnership since 2019. So what we do mostly is help deliver on our Prime Minister announcement for a Canadian contribution towards $100 million for climate risk insurance, and this is going to contribute to what Germany highlighted in the session yesterday, the G7 proposal for global shield against climate risks, which will aim to strengthen the global architecture for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. Canada is also able to leverage its role in the Instant Resilience Partnership, and we co-funded the Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solution. We're really interested in providing our funding for the most vulnerable, and that includes having an inclusive funding for loss and damage, including with gender. I think we had a presentation from Cruise, so Canada is also like supporting the initiative of Cruise. We're also providing funding under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, but we actually haven't started to report on the funding that we've provided through this the Sendai framework. So this is something that we're going to do this year, so we'll have a clearer picture of what has been done there. Regarding humanitarian assistance, we have a lot of things on humanitarian assistance for Canada, but we take note of the comments that it's not enough, it's not on a long enough time frame. But also, when we look at humanitarian assistance, it's not part of our climate finance, it's not under the UNFCCC, which brings me back to my point that loss and damage is broader than the UNFCCC, and I think when we reflect on this idea of funding arrangement for loss and damage, we also have to reflect on whether the UNFCCC is the right place or is the only place where we want to look at funding arrangement for loss and damage. I'll stop here, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Canada. So, some work, there is a lot of work on risk insurance, humanitarian assistance, but it still doesn't quite answer some of the questions about the redevelopment which Mexico had raised earlier. It could, I don't know. But then the issue of whether it should be in UNFCCC or financing arrangements elsewhere, what's the landscape? You did also raise a question about lack of definition of loss and damage, or understanding of loss and damage, within, and therefore that is also, we're going to actually the barriers or challenges, but actually one of the questions I wanted to also have a discussion on is, we have this avert, minimize, and address. Again, would it help if people have better clarity on what each are, and maybe would that help also to facilitate? I'm just a facilitator putting the questions out there. So maybe I'll stop there, not to put you on a spot, and turn to Maldives. So thank you, Eileen, for joining us.
My colleague Leanne was ahead of me, so she can speak first.
Whoever, I mean, keep this informal.
Thanks.
Thank you, Leah.
So hello again, everyone. Thanks. I think it has been interesting hearing all the different perspectives so far. I want to start by saying that we made a statement yesterday from AOSIS speaking about where we saw the largest gap, and that was in the addressing part of loss and damage. So we do acknowledge that there is financing happening. We've heard a lot about averting, minimizing, but for us, it's the addressing loss and damage where there's significant gaps. We took stock of some of the work that has been done in this process to explore the question before us, which is around what has been done in terms of financing. We, for example, went back to 2016 to look at the SCF Forum, and there was output there that spoke to some of the various areas, and we heard some of that coming out from previous speakers. So we heard about the risk transfer systems, the social protection schemes, and then there's also reference to catastrophe resilience bonds and contingent financing, etc. But we also acknowledge that while some of these mechanisms or facilities are out there, there has also been barriers to some of the vulnerable populations being able to benefit from and access some of these resources. So reflecting on that 2016 event and the outputs, for example, it spoke about market barriers where some of the systems that are within the market are out of reach for those who are among the vulnerable. And then in terms of risk transfer schemes, it spoke about the high or the continuous need for paying premiums. And again, it puts it out of reach for some countries, as well as the lack of subsidies for low-income households, and the list goes on. We then looked again at the 2016 SUVA Expert Dialogue, and there was a technical paper on elaborating sources of financial support available for addressing loss and damage. Amongst other things, it highlighted the challenges that were faced, particularly by SIDS and LDCs. Among them, insufficient financing to reduce risk, and they mentioned here relocation, limited sources of financing, and particularly where you have high levels of indebtedness for some countries, and also the ability to have timely access to post-disaster finance to support recovery and reconstruction. We're moving in time again, and then we went to 2019. The Secretariat prepared a technical paper on the elaboration of sources of and modalities for accessing finance to support addressing loss and damage, etc. This was an input to the 2019 WIM review, and that also provided a lot of information in terms of what is out there, building on the previous events that were mentioned before, and it was also validating a lot of the information that came out of those events. There's also, the document that Angela spoke about, whilst I didn't read it, but it certainly also seemed to have been pulling and looking at similar information and making the point, which is there is financing for loss and damage. However, we're acknowledging that one, it is not enough, but two, there are gaps when it comes to financing for addressing loss and damage. I will continue. When we consider, for example, the issue of slow onset events, non-economic losses, these are the areas that we see significant gaps. And I think some of that started to come out, and thanks as well to Angela for raising some of those issues. When we speak about the rehabilitation of damaged assets or ecosystems, when we talk about heritage, when we look at recovery of lost assets or income, that's lost for businesses and people who are working, when we talk about a lot of social protection, and importantly, the issue of displacement, this is where we see a lot of the gaps happening, and that's also a driving factor behind why AOSIS has been vocal about the need for a facility. We acknowledge that whilst there is some level of financing, the current arrangements do not facilitate access to resources for some of these types of issues. So there's more that I can say, but I think I will just leave it there and certainly welcome any additional reflections on that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamaica, for your useful contribution. So we have the German Watch report, we have the work from the SEF Forum, we have SUVA Dialogue, and we have one more report, 2019, right? Secretariat report. So we have some reports out there which which come to the conclusion that yes, there is acknowledgement that there is financing, but as some delegates here are suggesting that that's not enough for addressing. And then there are some identified issues: slow onset events, non-economic losses, loss of assets and heritage sites, issue of displacement, which are areas being identified, at least by some delegations, as areas needing more finance. And of course, the critical issue at hand is how do you facilitate more finance towards these areas. And we'll get to the solution later, but maybe I don't want to spend too much time on the gaps. I think if you agree that this is a good area of what the problem statement is, maybe we can move on to the next few questions. But I will stop there, and there are a couple of more interventions. So Maldives, again, thank you for your indulgence of giving the floor to Jamaica first. After Maldives, we have the Philippines and France. So over to you, Eileen.
Okay, I still want to talk about the gaps as well. Yeah. Okay, so when we talk about loss and damage finance, we often hear...
sorry, maybe you take on.
Okay. Okay, when we talk about loss and damage finance, it's usually, we are hearing about humanitarian assistance and support in the aftermath of rapid onset events. But I want to talk about slow onset events. Yeah. So with my experience from the Maldives, where coastal erosion in our islands is a big problem, with just 1.5 meters above sea level on average, almost all of our islands are now experiencing beach or erosion. And the cost of addressing this issue is humongous when compared to the scale of available resources. For example, some estimates are showing that to address this problem in just only our inhabited islands would cost us $8.8 billion, which is like 4 times our entire national budget. And also, there is no return on investment for coastal protection, so it's not easy for us to attract private finance for this as well. So we have to go to the funds, the financial mechanism. And then when we go there, we have to demonstrate bankability, scale, and other metrics like number of beneficiaries are used to assess the merits of a project. But in the Maldives, we have so many inhabited islands where we have populations of less than 500 people living. And then these people have been living there all for generations, so we just can't, they have the right to continue living there. And then the other option for us would be to resettle them. And if we are to design a resettlement project, then it becomes a high ESS category project, and for which direct access entities would not be accredited for, and we have to go seek the support of a large international partner. And then we often find that our priorities don't match with their priorities, because again, they are also looking at scale and return on investment among these things. So I don't think the current climate finance architecture is designed to support slow onset events, especially for small island countries. And I think this is a discussion that we need to have, and I think the UNFCCC process is the right place to have this discussion, and also to have the funding mechanism to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maldives. I know just a point, when you intervene, you all seem to look at me. That's fine, but particularly for those in the front or the back, look at each other, because you are talking to each other, not to me. I'm just facilitating. So please, I would like the attention a lot, but please. But thank you so much, Maldives. I think another delegation have raised one big gap, which is slow onset events, and making the case for the UNFCCC to take this up. Can we have Philippines and then France? So maybe France, you can come back with some of what you think about how we can address some of the needs that are being articulated very strongly here from some parties. Philippines, you're free to do so as well. So Philippines, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving us this opportunity to manifest our response, hopefully to fast-track the completion of this dialogue and achieve the most needed outcome, since it's anyway clear to us that climate change is real and has been causing havoc, has affected many lives, livelihoods, and health and longevity of economies. Borrowing from the words of the Executive Secretary in her opening statement at the GGA workshop this morning. We're now sharing to you our views and recommendations for consideration. And these are primarily, of course, based on how the Philippines being one of the most vulnerable, have coped up assisting communities that suffer losses and damages because of disasters we attribute to climate change. First, on the question on the possible arrangements for funding of activities to avert, minimize, or address loss and damage associated with adverse impacts. Our proposition here is to address loss and damages arising from climate change through some preposition fund, which may we now call as the Glasgow facility for loss and damages, which should be established from which to quickly draw funds to support disaster-affected countries. This facility should be sourced from the annual contributions of developed country parties based on their historical responsibilities under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. This should be in addition to other risk transfer mechanisms, as was already
Philippines.
elucidated to earlier,
Philippines.
such as but not limited to the catastrophe bonds, parametric insurance, and forecast-based financing and crop insurance. Yes.
You're going into the fourth question.
I'm sorry.
Would you want to just address what are the gaps first?
Okay, so as to the gaps,
Yes.
I'm sorry about that.
Please come back later because I think your solution, your recommendation is something we would like to hear in question D.
Yes, yes.
So maybe
well, primarily what we wanted to say is that the existing financial resources and instruments available at the local level are not really enough, as manifested by other parties that have made their statement today, because they have limited applicability for addressing loss and damages. The existing capacities are overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the impact and compounding nature of climate events. Let me give you a very specific case where we have actually policies in place to put the annual budgets of governments, both at the national and local level, to place 5% of our budgets for disaster risk reduction. A certain percentage of it, I believe 30%, will be for pre-disaster preparations, and 70% are attributed to response. But quite frankly, this is not enough to actually tide over our bouts, with continuing bouts with typhoons and other meteorological hazards that are attributed to changes in climate. So this is a good practice for, insofar as practice is concerned, but this is severely limited by our limited in the resources that we put into. These are reason for putting in a stronger voice to not only preclude that immediate action and support for that funding facility which we are proposing, even while we are discussing issues of trying to differentiate loss and damage versus adaptation measures. That's all for that question about gaps and ways to address. Mr. Facilitator, thank you.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for interrupting you, but welcome you to come back later. So noted, national budgets, I think some parties have also mentioned is one way, but not enough, and it's just for the scale that is needed. France. France and EU.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not speaking on behalf of France, but I'm from Denmark, and I think I'm speaking as part of the EU team. So I think I wanted to react to some of the things and sort of keep the dialogue going and some of the things that has been said, because I think there has been some very useful interventions that are sort of, in a sense, to me, starting to opening this box about what is the gaps and what is it that is there and that is not there when we talk about sort of arrangements for financing loss and damage. And I think, I think in a sense Mexico already started and sort of continued from the discussion yesterday and said that it's sort of really sort of the addressing part perhaps that is the one that needs to be looked most into. And I think when I listened to Jamaica, I think that was sort of really useful, sort of opening that box further and sort of talking a little bit about what is it then that is there and that is not there when we talk about addressing loss and damage. I would think that sort of in that space, sort of where we are addressing loss and damage, there's been some discussions about humanitarian assistance and what does it do and what does it not do. And I think I would agree with those that say that at least a large, I also come from sort of a development, cooperation, humanitarian background. That's sort of my normal line of work. So I also say that a lot of the humanitarian work we are actually doing now and the support that is provided is actually related to weather-related disasters. So, and it's probably right that it may not be enough. It may not be enough if we consider what's going to happen in the future as climate change will continue. And it may not be sufficiently geared to sort of move into sort of from the immediate disaster phase into sort of the post-disaster and recovery and sort of to the long term. And I think this is perhaps one of the areas where we need to do more work. I think there's already some work going on in that space, and I think several colleagues have mentioned that. And I would also mention that sort of, for example, we are working with the Red Cross to sort of try to put in place, to work on sort of types of, put in place forecast-based financing, then in a sense try to put in place mechanisms that can provide financing before a disaster is happening and can mobilize it super rapidly when it happens. And I think that's sort of one example of something that is moving into that space. I think also the CRIP we had yesterday is an example in a sense of a mechanism that is moving into that space. Then I think Jamaica also mentioned social protection, and I think that's, to me is also perhaps one of the, I think that's something that we have sort of been working more and more on lately. I think it's something that perhaps needs to be worked much more on, because at least to me that's one type of an arrangement that is actually trying to reach and put something in place for the poorest and most vulnerable parts of the population, and put something in place that allow them, in a sense, to address the climate problem or other problem that they're facing in the way they find best, by giving them some resources to do so. So I think that's an instrument that is interesting and moving into that space, but perhaps it's not good enough yet, and perhaps there's a need to sort of work much more on those types of instruments. I think I also heard that Jamaica was talking about that problem, that one of the problems with some of those risk transfer and insurance instruments is this issue of premium and sort of that for countries that are already perhaps poor or very indebted, there's a need for something that the country is not able to provide itself, to put in place that types of mechanisms. And I think that also applies if you move further down, in a sense, to local level and to communities, that poor communities are probably not able to put in place those mechanisms by themselves. They need some assistance to do that. And I think these are sort of the types of things that we need to identify in this discussion, that is in a sense opening this gap box a little bit and sort of looking into what is really in it. Then I think my colleagues just mentioned that you have mentioned some of the other background documents that is already providing some analysis on what is there and what is not there. And then I think we would like to mention that there's a study that OECD has been doing actually on loss and damages related to climate change, that is also sort of exploring this field, and are also actually, I think, providing some helpful insights into what is there and what is not there, and also sort of trying to think a little bit ahead what will be needed in the future that I think could inform this discussion. Thank you.
Colleagues, thank you so much. I think I want to thank you for engaging in this exercise. I find it encouraging. I think on this particular, maybe the first question, if I can ask for your views, I think initially what we will do is at least identify the various reports that have been mentioned, OECD, German Watch, the four that Jamaica, and I can't recall all that. I know Suva Dialogue, of course. So we put that as these reports will be useful for us to get a lay of the land of what's out there or what are the gaps. In terms of the gaps and challenges, I think there has been acknowledgement that there is not enough work on the addressing part. If anyone who feels that disagree with that problem statement, let me know. Okay, so not enough work. There is, so maybe I frame it better. There is work on loss and damage across averting, minimizing, addressing. But the real issue appears to be addressing. And that is one big gap that has been identified by a number of you here today. Within that realm, there is the issue of other specific issues. So I mentioned a couple: slow onset event, non-economic losses, issue of displacement, loss of assets and heritage. And I appreciate your intervention by the EU on also acknowledging that humanitarian work, yes, we're doing a lot, but we can do more. Social protection is another area that we could do more to help the vulnerable. And risk transfer, how to address that, the financing of some of this mechanism. I'll stop there for any reflections before we move. I think this perhaps can be our problem statement, and then we can go to the other questions. Am I going beyond my bounds as a facilitator in trying to capture the gaps at least? Yes, Jamaica.
Thanks. I wanted to also share a little bit from country experiences. Recently, we received resources from, I'm sorry, I'm trying to look out, from a multilateral source, and it was largely loan to address an issue that was happening along the coast. And so we find that when we're having the slow onset issues, as Eileen mentioned, like in the Maldives, we are now having to use our loan resources or access to loan resources, which also then adds to our debt to address these issues as well. And this was because that particular stretch along the coast is in the capital, and it is protecting not just some vulnerable communities like the fishing village, etc., but also important infrastructure that's located there. And we recognize that sea level rise is a driving factor. So in terms of even that financing element, we're also now taking these loans and putting ourselves in more debt to then be able to address some of the issues that we're experiencing. So just wanted to share that as another issue that we're seeing as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think if there's no objection, we will close the discussion on the first question, which I think is relatively, well, okay, it's still difficult. Maybe we go to the second question. I don't know if we're flogging the horse a little bit, but maybe I'll try. Okay, so the second question is, what support has been effective? And I think some of you have mentioned a little bit in your interventions earlier, at averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And what lessons learned could improve funding and what practices should be replicated and scaled up. So at least for me, the risk insurance, the CRIF example, is it CRIF? It's CRIF. Example yesterday was what appealed to me as something practical, making a difference on the ground. Just to share, I'm not, in my own national capacity, Singapore is also doing something on risk insurance for Southeast Asia, for the Cambodia and Laos in particular, along the same lines, which is at the onset of a crisis, a disaster, the first line of credit is there to save lives. And I think maybe that can go to the D part, which is one of the solutions. So I'm just picking up from there. It seemed to me B is a little bit like D. So I don't know if we want to address B and D together. What do you all think? If not, maybe why don't we do C first? I think let's address question C. Can we throw the question up on the slide again? Which is, what are the barriers and challenges countries face? And then we go to C or D, which point to solutions. Do you agree? Okay. So maybe C. So what are the barriers and challenges? So we did hear debt issues earlier. Any other issues to throw into the pot? Country, national experiences to share. Camilla, we are addressing C now. And my suggestion is to take B and D together because they seem to point towards how do we solve the problem. So C, so more about challenges and barriers. We heard the gaps, the challenges of financing. Any other issues parties would like to share? Yes, thank you for breaking the ice again. Camila, Mexico.
Thank you, Joe. For the barriers, I mean, this goes for pretty much all funding on finance, on climate finance, but specifically for loss and damage, when the funding is needed more rapidly. When we're talking about existing facilities, most of them, for every project, it requires a long process, a long bureaucratic process. And this varies from entity to agencies to funds to different initiatives. They all have different processes, and that's an extremely overwhelming burden for developing countries, because for each facility you have to know what template you have to fill in, what form you have to fill in. And given that, for example, for loss and damage, there's not a single available resource, but we're talking about, again, when we're talking about averting and minimizing, not addressing, but we're talking about myriad of options that we don't even know necessarily are out there, but then when there's each specific fund or each specific facility or each specific partnership, it always requires some kind of development of the project. And we need capacity building to even start developing that project. Most of them would ask for a risk assessment of the situation, and countries don't even have the resources to do a risk assessment when we're already talking about loss and damage. So it's a problem for all climate finance, but then when we're talking about loss and damage, it becomes even harder, because we're talking now, we have the impasse now, we're in an extreme situation, it's vulnerable communities, vulnerable countries that right now they're even trying to rebuild. They don't have now more of the capacity to sort of build format A and format B, and with the accredited agency, and with all of the very extenuous and long steps that you have to take care of before even getting the resources and applying to a project. So that's why it is so important to address loss and damage in a specific manner, because there's more urgency to those needs. And it is a barrier when the countries don't even have those institutional capacities to first know everything that is out there, and secondly, how to apply. And I'm speaking from a country that has quite an experience on applying to funds. We are very fortunate that we access to most of them. Even as a middle-income country, we still have needs and we still apply to them. And for us, it's a burden. I can't imagine what it is for a developing country that is in the risk of a natural disaster. So that's a huge barrier.
Thank you, Mexico, Camila. The access and the process for applying for funds is one key challenge. Jamaica, I heard you raise, EOCs did raise this also, access as a big-ish challenge, so over to you.
Thank you. I was actually wondering if Philippines had their flag before me. Oh, okay, thank you. I had raised some issue. I'm sorry, Joe, I just can't help but looking at you. Maybe I'll divert between you and Malcolm, it's just easier. I don't think he's hearing me. Yeah, I did raise some issues in my previous intervention, but I wanted to also perhaps pull a little bit more on, for example, experiences that we've had in accessing some of the resources. And since we're looking broader at avert, minimize, and address, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, is one of the entities in the financing mechanism. When we think about the time it takes to be able to access some of those resources, there is, for example, an average of 12 to 22 months for the approval of different processes for project development, and then an average of 24 months for project approval through the direct access modalities. And then again, there are the various different requirements. I know from our own experience, sometimes we're being asked to dig deep and try and find the kinds of data and information that often is difficult to come by, which also adds to the time lags in accessing some of those resources. There's the Adaptation Fund, and we do recognize that it is working, and there is still some work to capitalize that. Hopefully when the market mechanism is in full swing, then some of those issues will be addressed. And then, we could also speak to the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, which is also underfunded. So when we think about some of these entities that are already in the UNFCCC process, we have different types of access issues. The GCF, for example, has readiness support, project preparation facility, project funding facility. But oftentimes, it's not as easy to get the resources under these different streams of resources that they have. And so we believe that there is need for us to address the access issues, because that in and of itself is a real barrier, especially when you have many of the states that have very small teams that are working in climate change and also working in environment, and also having to put significant capacity resources into preparing these proposals, or having oversight, whatever the case may be. So I think I will stop there for now.
Thank you, and Philippines, and thank you for your indulgence, giving way.
Thank you very much, Facilitator. The question was on what particular barriers and challenges are we facing on accessing the arrangements for funding. I share the views that the latency of provision of the funds might be limited by the visibility of such funding arrangements, but they are also somewhat limited by the degree of knowledge and information available for those that are availing of them. So I will talk particular 4 points. One is, of course, the lack of appreciation or information as to the traditional knowledges and practices that should be able to inform policies. I'm talking about financial instruments and policies that are somewhat unreachable or somewhat not attuned to the needs of those that are needing them, especially in needy communities during the times of calamitous events attributed to climate disasters, climate changes, of course. Therefore, this is also rooted in our inability to develop a robust information systems that will allow us to inform both government units, communities, as well as groups to gain greater access to direct financing. A third barrier or a challenge for us is the compartmentalization of the grants, investments, and subsidies, and whatever forms of financial support that is needed by public and private stakeholders, which are quite differentiated. And possibly a fourth challenge for us is to be able to come up with a system to monitor and evaluate these financial instrumentalities, as well as degrees of access by those that are needing, requiring, and have successfully accessed them, and to further identify development needs and, of course, to address gaps. So that's what we currently have right now in terms of challenges and barriers, of course, beyond resource availability.
Thank you, Philippines. To the EU, please.
Thank you. Perhaps Jamaica was before me and also Canada, but I'm happy to speak if...
Jamaica has spoken already.
Okay.
So just bear with me. you go first. Yeah. Everyone is so kind here. So
oh, sorry about that. No, I wanted to reflect a little bit, sort of in a sense going back to the question raised by Mexico, sort of about access and barriers related to loss and damage finance and loss and damage. And I was, and it's perhaps a little bit thinking about what is specific for access to loss and damage finance compared to access to finance for adaptation, for example, because I think some of the things that I just heard sounds like I was about to say the usual access problems, but in a sense it's perhaps the issues about access to financing from the Green Climate Fund or from other funds that we have discussed before, I think, in other forums and in UNFCCC, and that we have sort of worked with and perhaps not solved quite yet. But I was thinking about is there something that is specific to loss and damage finance, and perhaps in particular when we move to the main gap that is when we are sort of in this addressing part, is there then some access issues and barriers that are specific and specifically difficult to that, or are there other ways perhaps we can address it than we would address it if we're talking about other types of finance? And then I was thinking, well, firstly, that there's the humanitarian aid in the sense that is in this space, and I think humanitarian aid, one thing that is very characteristic of humanitarian aid is that it can be mobilized very fast. And that I know from my own organization, that can be mobilized perhaps within a few days, which is completely different from other types of finance, which is completely different from sort of development or climate finance that requires sort of all these sort of processes and procedures and proposals and so on. But that's something where humanitarian finance is very different. And I think also some of the mechanisms we have talked about that is beginning to sort of evolve and being put in place, and I think something like the CRIP that we heard about yesterday is actually an example of something that has, in a sense, in advance of something happening, thought about the whole access part. So that means that when the resources are needed, it actually makes them available extremely fast. And I think that's also some of the other mechanisms that we have talked about, like sort of the risk transfer types of schemes or social protection networks, and all those are in a sense arrangements that do, in a sense, try to get rid of all the red tape related to sort of normal project preparation procedures and do all that in advance. In a sense, sort of forecast are much more forecast based. Yeah, so it's just sort of a reflection on that, and sort of I think it's perhaps useful for the discussion when we move forward to and again sort of open the box again and really think about sort of what is specific for the problems we want to solve here in relation to loss and damage.
Thank you, the EU. I think good question. The examples you gave do suggest that there is a degree of speed. Of course, it's up to parties again to give a different, an alternative view. So maybe I see Mexico, you put your flag up. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity to respond in a spirit of a dialogue. And in Jamaica, if you wish, also we can get back to EU's question, which is what is unique about the access issue to loss and damage vis-a-vis adaptation or mitigation finance. So Camila, please.
Thank you for letting me jump in, and I did want to reply to the European Union. And that's the thing, is that when you talk about humanitarian assistance, yes, that is immediate, but that is immediate only to the big tragedies, only to those who made headlines. And there's definitely not enough, and not for a long time. I mean, even if we're talking about, okay, maybe there's more involvement with the Red Cross, maybe I exaggerated with a week, but honestly, it doesn't go beyond weeks. And that has been proven over and over and over. And when we're talking about loss and damage, it's not just the providing food and shelter for people who had been displaced momentarily. We're talking about we have to rebuild a community. And for rebuilding a community, that's not what humanitarian assistance is for. Humanitarian assistance is for relief of the victims in a very short period of time. But loss and damage is way more than that. It's, again, impacted communities that have their lives transformed, not for a week, not for a month, for the rest of their lives. And so for projects that we're talking about rebuilding, that's when it's usually when you discuss it in the finance area, it's like, oh, but you need to develop a project for it. And when you need to develop a project, you go into this nightmare logistics of bureaucratic processes for, and I'm not talking only about Green Climate Fund and Jeff, I'm talking about all the existing financial architecture out there. And most of it, it's, as was mentioned yesterday, most of it, it's actually bared by the families. And the families get into huge debt themselves to try to rebuild. we don't have any solution right now as it is in the financial architecture to address loss and damage in a medium longer term. And it's not humanitarian assistance. There's nothing there out there. And what is out there is extremely difficult to access given the urgency of the needs for loss and damage. So that's the difference, at least how I would say, not even Mexico, but how I perceive it.
Thank you, Mexico, Camila. Over to you, Jamaica.
Yes, thanks, and thanks as well. So I do agree that in terms of humanitarian aid, it's usually very, very quick and able to help, especially in reaching some of the vulnerable communities. So I don't think we were discounting the value of humanitarian aid at all. I think going back to the first question and some of the first intervention, we've acknowledged that one of the gaps is in terms of addressing loss and damage and some of the financing required for some of the slow onset events and non-economic losses. So there's one side of the coin that looks at the extreme events when the hurricanes happen or the protracted droughts, etc. There is aid that often comes in, and we've all acknowledged that even this may not necessarily be sufficient, but it does help. So it's not discounting that, but it's also recognizing that it's not enough in many instances, and that it doesn't speak to some of the other issues that are also happening at the same time. I can also speak from a beneficiary country of the CRIF SPC. We have currently a policy that looks at hurricanes. So this is now me, Jamaica. We have a policy looking at hurricanes and also excess rainfall. The excess rainfall policy came after, and we have, I think we've gotten some resources, but there were a few events that happened, and because the parametric triggers were not met, we had significant loss and damage, including infrastructure. Persons lost, some of their business assets and those kinds of things. And the government was then forced to dig into its pocket because, yes, we did have this parametric insurance, but the trigger was not reached. And so we still then had to pay for, the consequences of those events. So it's not at all discounting the value of a system like CRIF because we still pay into it, we still have the premium. But then there were persons on the ground who may have only heard that we have this insurance policy that were asking the question. So why are we not getting monies from the system? And because of how the models were done and how the triggers were set up, we did not quite benefit the way that many had anticipated. So just to say as well that there are within these systems which are necessary, which we still continue to pay our premiums in, gaps in the way that we can benefit for some of the events, especially when the triggers are beyond what exists, but when the situation is such that there are communities that were significantly affected. There's one community I remember that I visited, and because of the type of terrain, there were significant breakaways in the road. And unfortunately, we did not have any access to these risk transfer facilities that could have assisted in rebuilding the road. And so they literally had to be walking miles to be able to access certain types of services. So these are some of the issues that we do face on the ground. While recognizing we do need systems like the CRIF themselves also mentioned that their resources are for the immediate. There is an event, they're able to pay out within, I think, 14 days, and they sometimes try to do it even before then, so that the government has that continuity happening. but more is needed. And this is speaking from local experience. Thanks.
Maybe you yes, introduce yourself. I think you're from the ILO, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Kaufsila, thank you very much. Pranav Prasad from ILO.
And welcome to have an international organization come into the fray here. So thank you so much.
No, being in the UN system, I think it's our privilege to be a part of it. So thank you very much. So I'll just want to kind of, in the spirit of dialogue, quickly react to some of the things that we are hearing. And having worked in insurance for some time, and especially with CRIF and in Jamaica and South Asia, so quick reactions. One thing, I think it's very right that the insurance does not cover everything. CRIF is able to pay out because of the parametric way in which it has been set up, but then there's a cost to it. The more coverage that is required, the more is the premium to be paid. And it is kind of, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but it's set up at the sovereign level. So it remains at the sovereign level, and how the governments work with it and how it deal with it is a different issue. The big, I think, I should not call it an elephant in the room, but I'm just throwing it out in the thing. We are constantly talking about mechanisms of access and access for vulnerable communities, but we are all here representing what I call the supply side of the situation. We, I believe, need to understand a lot more on the demand side as to what is actually required by the vulnerable, so-called vulnerable communities at still not the individual level, but still at the community level, to understand how they, Jamaica just brought up the issue about access. So even if it's available, they need to walk miles and miles to be able to access those mechanisms too, even if the amount is available. So I think one of the big gaps, and I'm seeing it reflected in these questions also, is how to ensure that the demand side of the story gets reflected in any of the mechanisms that need to be set up, are set up, or how can the so-called distribution side be built up so that the aid reaches the point where it is required to be reached. We have communities that need, or as Mexico very elegantly put it, their entire culture is disrupted, their entire lifestyle is disrupted. It's a full rebuilding process that needs to be done. What are their requirements? How do they perceive what has happened till now? What do they actually want? So a so-called bottoms-up approach or a customer-centric approach. I think if we are to look at loss and damage in that light, to include the demand side of the story, we would perhaps have solutions that are acceptable at different levels and are facilitated in the transmission there. We've seen colleagues from European Union talking about examples about preservation and early responses, etc. And I had also brought up this issue about asset preservation versus asset replacement yesterday. I think this entire issue of what is required on the ground needs to be kind of looked at in a different way, rather than, I should not say rather than, in addition to the supply side of the story, by saying these are the ways available, these are the ways we can make it available, but then it still remains at a couple of levels away from the so-called vulnerable communities who we all say we are wanting to benefit. So without harping the point too much, let me just stop here to say that I think it's important that we discuss the demand side of the story also, in addition to the supply side and the mechanisms that are available. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your contribution and for reminding us who are we helping and to seek their views as well. I have Canada, Switzerland, Maldives, and Colombia, and maybe I'll close the list here for this particular question. I'm not sure if I want to go in the order, or maybe Maldives and Colombia, you want to go first? Right, okay, so Colombia, maybe, if Canada and Switzerland don't mind, because I want to present one side, and then maybe we'll go over to your side, okay? So Colombia, please. Any reports for us, Trish?
Thank you. Thank you, co-facilitator. Well, I don't have a report, but I can share with you the experience that we have in Colombia. Just to react in terms of the comments made by European Union. In 2010, La Niña event had social and economic consequences to the country that continued to be addressed a decade after, and which led to the creation of the Colombian Adaptation Fund. This is not an adaptation fund per se. This event had cost equivalent to $6 billion US, close to 2% of the GDP at that time in 2010. And our National Adaptation Fund has allocated a total of $2.25 billion to address direct effects of the 2010-2011 La Niña events in affected areas directed to health, infrastructure, livelihoods, transportation, water and sanitation and education, economic recovery and environment sectors. So this is more a fund that we have in Colombia, not for adaptation, but just for, let's say, recovery or when we have this kind of disasters. Just to say that in our case, and in this specific case, we decided to request loans, and we're still paying for that since 2010, just to have a clear picture of our situation in Colombia. We share the views expressed by Mexico in the sense that humanitarian assistance perhaps came to Colombia at that time. This is quickly, but not too quickly as we expected, and we're still dealing with our lands. So I think that the comments made by Lian and Jamaica in that sense it's similar in terms of our situation. We're still paying. And we think that humanitarian assistance is not enough. This is just for a limited period of time, for a limited activities at national level. So we need to rebuild our infrastructure, our livelihood, support for displacement persons, and all measures to address non-economic loss and damage. Many countries, and I think Colombia and most of Latin American and Caribbean countries and all vulnerable countries still finance their risk transfer premiums with debt. We would like to highlight that perhaps one of the difficulties that we have in terms of accessing financial support is, for example, the differentiation. We know that perhaps still some differentiation. We understand that some countries, they have more difficulty than others, but at the end of the day, we are particularly vulnerable also in Colombia, and as it has been widely evidenced by the IPCC. All countries, Latin American countries, is still being particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And these kind of differentiations that some donors are doing is not helping in our national problems. As I mentioned before, the Adaptation Fund, it's a clear example in terms of what we are doing. In terms of the insurance, because I want to react on the comments made by the previous speaker, we see some limits of insurance. Big international initiatives, for example, like the Insurance Global Partnership, focus on financing risk transfer, particularly insurance. However, insurance is only one of the existing finance mechanisms and has its limitation. For example, several limitations have been pointed out to risk transfer instruments, including insurance, They cannot meet all of our government ex-post financing needs, but rather can complement other instruments. Many countries, as I mentioned before, finance their risk transfer premiums with debt, and many countries do not have that risk transfer adequately meets their needs while considering competing budget priorities and realistic planning horizons. They have associated high cost. And we just want to highlight that in most of the Latin American countries, as well as in Colombia, and the cooperation is sending people to climate-induced debt, which is not fair with us. So we think, and we are reducing the fiscal space in our country because of the losses and damage. So we think it's important to look at this kind of experience and the need to work on it and of course to fill the gaps that we have in financing for loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Colombia. If I can just say something provocative. Interesting that you have set up an adaptation fund, but it is more about losses and damages. So I just thought that was curious. So thank you for that. Maldives, please.
I want to talk about the interaction between slow onset events like sea level rise and key risks for small islanders like us, highlighted in the IPCC report. That puts us in a vicious cycle with each new disaster and continuous exposure to slow onset events. Our financial vulnerability grows while our capacity to respond to future unavoidable extreme events and disaster weaken at the same time. Our adaptive capacity in the Maldives is already very constrained, as highlighted many times before. Accessing support from multilateral funds is an extremely lengthy process, which we do not have the capacity for. When we do apply for projects, we are asked to demonstrate the climate relevance of the project intervention with scientific studies undertaken at the local level, which requires high upfront costs and technical capacity, which we cannot afford. The approval process takes years, that is from conception to approval. By the time they reach us, on-the-ground reality is drastically changed. What I just highlighted is difficulty in accessing financial resources for avoiding and averting, that is for mitigation and adaptation. There's currently no systematic and predictable funding structure to address the critical issue of loss and damage. With humanitarian aid, it is crucial, yes, but it only covers only a small portion, operational cost, if I may call it that. It is not set up or funded to address the scale and pace of the climate impacts we are facing back at home. In the case of Maldives, people in some islands are required to be relocated to others, like Eileen highlighted before, because of severe erosion and flooding. In this 1.1 degrees world, 90% of all our islands already experience some form of erosion. Within the existing financial system, there's a clear gap to address these non-economic losses, fundamental losses to heritage and identity. We do need something additional to what already exists. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reminding us again about the non-economic losses. Over to Canada, please. Oh, yes, Colombia, okay. Thank you, please.
If I may, co-facilitator, and apologies, Canada, just to clarify the name of the fund, because just to highlight that we call it adaptation fund, because at that time, it was not clear to us the concept of loss and damage. We didn't have the WIM and the EXCOM, so that's why we call it adaptation at that time. Now we realize that it's more for disaster and reconstruction and this kind of stuff. Just to clarify, because at that time, 2010, it was a different context in comparison of the discussions that we are having nowadays in terms of losses and damages. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the clarification, so not to be used as a precedent. Okay, so thank you so much. Over to Canada, please.
Thank you very much, and it's very helpful to hear from many parties on this issue, and I will try to respond to some of the comments that have been made. So Canada very much agree, like we recognize that there's a lot of delays in accessing funding, and I'm talking mostly about climate finance, and loss and damage is different in many ways than adaptation, such as requires really quick access to funding in case of extreme weather event. But as it was mentioned, like humanitarian assistance can be very fast, but it's not part of our climate finance. We really understand the concern raised by developing country about accessing climate finance. It is a burdensome process, we recognize it. I was going to point out to the GCF readiness program, but I understand that, as Jamaica pointed out, it's probably not perfect and maybe it needs to be improved, so this is something that maybe we'll need to look into. I also want to point out that Canada is contributing to the Climate Access Network, Climate Finance Access Network, CFAN. We provided so far 9.5 million, and this is to help some of the most vulnerable countries, notably Pacific, small island developing state, to more easily access international climate finance. We would like to hear, and I think we've heard a lot of people already, but it's really helpful for us to hear from the experience of many countries in accessing funding, climate finance, but also other types of funding that may not be under climate finance, but are also addressing some areas under loss and damage. I also understand these questions to be about barriers, but also gaps, so I also have something on gaps. We're really interested in knowing like what kinds of areas of the loss and damage spectrum are not covered. I know so far we heard like the longer term part, the slow onset events, non-economic losses, which is of particularly interest in Canada, especially for our indigenous communities in the north. So it's very important, as I think it was mentioned, I don't remember the name of the person, but it was about the understanding more from the demand side, and this is really helpful for us to point out which specific area of the loss and damage spectrum may need to be improved. I also want to thank the Philippines to point out to the lack of information about the loss and damage finance. And I think it speaks to what I mentioned earlier, that loss and damage is really broad. We do not have a global view of what is loss and damage support because it's scattered. And so we're really interested in exploring ways on how we can have a more coordinated approach on loss and damage funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to get this right, so it's the climate finance access. Sorry, I didn't catch it.
It is the Climate Finance Access Network.
Network, and it's 9.5.
That is just Canada's contribution.
9.5 million.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if there are any other contributions for that?
I do not have the other countries' contribution, but maybe other countries that have contributed to this can speak up.
Okay, maybe again in a spirit of sharing information, if you have a point of contact or some details for where parties who are here saying that they have access issues, maybe they can, after this meeting, reach out to you, so avail themselves of this particular facility so that they can figure out how to close the gap identified by Philippines, which is we don't know what's out there. So I thank you so much for that contribution, and actually that's part of the solution which we will come later. So thank you, Canada. And again, I invite all others here, please reach out to Canada after this so that we at least, if there's nothing else we go home with a point of contact and we know how to get facilitate access quicker. Switzerland.
Thank you very much. And this is a very interesting conversation for me because, yes, I mean, working in the climate finance space, I'm very used to the conversation around the access issue related to large funds, not just the climate funds, but others, cumbersome approval processes and so on. And we're actually trying to do our best. There are proposals for simplified approval procedures in the GCF being blocked in the board for political reasons. Ask your colleagues in the board. Anyway, but I mean, there is the idea and the interest to actually make it easier, and I think we have a common interest here. I'm myself and the Deaf Council. One of the most common question I ask is how can we make the approval procedures easier? How can we speed up the pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. So also as a contributor, we have a very large interest that the money that we put in a fund actually gets to the ground. So I think we have a shared interest here. But I would agree with Jens's point that this is it's an overarching access question. Doesn't mean we shouldn't address it, but I think it's not particular to loss and damage. But it was very interesting to hear the particular aspects that you see around loss and damage access. There's on the one side, the comment made, yeah, it has to be quick. So I think we have the humanitarian aid, which responds to the very quick response in the beginning, but then we hear it's not there long enough. And again, speaking just for the Swiss case, we're aware of that. That's why we started to restructure our development cooperation to move in this crisis response versus long-term cooperation, and then there's this space in between for rebuilding better. And maybe we have to think about what access has to look like in that space across the architecture, right? Not just, I think many people always keep talking about the operating entities under the financial mechanism, but they only can do so much. And if you look at the climate finance or the development finance and humanitarian aid out there, it's outnumbers those financing by far. And I think we really have to look at the full landscape and how we then address, for example, this space between quick response and then reconstruction and long-term support for rebuilding, and what the access to that kind of finance has to look like. And I hear the comment from those saying, well, especially vulnerable communities, it doesn't help if the financing is there if they are so limited to not get to the funding. So we also have to consider that, I think. And for me, it was a very interesting round to hear feedback, and I think for our own development cooperation, we're taking some of that already into account, but maybe we also have to think about how the larger multilateral support could take that into account, the different spaces of response, right? And how it has to look like and which actor should fill which void to best address the challenges we have. Thank you. So this is mainly to appreciate, actually, the views shared so we can better understand where the challenge really is.
Thank you, Switzerland, also for very useful comments. The final say for this particular question is the USA. Over to you, please.
Sure, thanks. And just following, I appreciate the question from the Philippines on access, and I think I'll have to dig up some resources that we've had to pull together to help with where to go, because there is a lot. We say a spaghetti bowl in some places where there's just a lot of different things out there, but unclear how to get it. And reiterate, very similar to Switzerland, the U.S. provides significant assistance to some of the multilateral funds too, and I think there's active conversations on access. There's a task force on access to climate finance that's led by the UK and Fiji. GCF and World Bank are actually on the task force too, as is the US and I think a couple other countries that's looking at this, that has some recommendations on how those multilaterals and bilateral funds can all do better to make sure money is flowing well. Again, this is a broader development instead of just loss and damage, but to try to address some of the issues with making sure that people have access to climate finance, because again, from a good donor perspective, we want to make sure money is getting to where it's needed. I'd also flag the locally led adaptation principles. USAID has signed on to them and encourage folks other folks to check them out, or parties to check them out, because it looks at how do we make sure we're getting money to local levels and people that need them. Again, more of a development side than pure loss and damage, but it's a good principles for us to be thinking about and how we make sure we're being as effective as possible with our assistance. And then just to also highlight some of the work that USAID has done in supporting a couple countries gaining access to GCF. I think it was 2022, last year, helped assist the Federated States of Micronesia and Palua to secure some more funding from the GCF. So there's sometimes support from donor countries to help get access to or support the applications to the different multilaterals. So flagging that also. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. Again, very encouraging this dialogue that is happening here. I think at a broader systemic level, that we all acknowledge there's this issue of access in the climate space, but there are work going on. So the US have mentioned the task force for access or climate finance that is ongoing. Narrowing down specifically to loss and damage, I think the issue of the continuum and the time. So we have humanitarian and disaster, which tries to address to get the quick access or funds to the needy at the time of crisis. But there is acknowledgement that that is more for immediate needs. The issue that is being highlighted is a broader one, which is when you go into the post-recovery stage. And that's where the demand is, and that's where the gaps are. Even for the immediate, other issues were raised, such as debt, the premium, the costs. And then in terms of going to the continuum, which is post-reconstruction, we come back to some of the priorities which were highlighted. Again, slow onset events, non-economic losses, which needs greater attention. Colleagues, forgive me if I didn't cover everything, but I guess this kind of sums up the issues at hand. If there's, maybe I open the floor if there's anything any of you want to specifically mention again or add. If not, then maybe we go to the real crunch of our discussion today, which is what can be done to improve and utilize synergies and complementarities. It's a long question, but I look at this question as what solutions can we bring to the table? What is out there? How can we find synergy so that we do things better? Some of them we already touched on. We did mention CRIF. We did mention risk insurance. Switzerland mentioned this facility that they have created, which helps developing countries access funds better. USAID has a program as well to address some of the issues of what is out there. So we can list some of this down as issues, but I will not prejudge discussion. It's really open to you now. So I open the floor. Is US flag a legacy one, or would you like to kick off discussion for a change? So over to you, colleagues. Maybe Jamaica, you want to kick off with the what you had raised in the plenary, which is the financing facility, if you wish to, of course. And get that out of the way, and then let's talk about other issues.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So we would have discussed a lot in Glasgow around the proposal that came from AOSIS for a loss and damage financing facility. Some of the information that we shared during this session and even outside of it are some of the reasons that we would have put that proposal on the table. Whilst we are not suggesting that the existing arrangements don't add value, what we're saying is that the gaps in arrangements specifically to loss and damage are not being addressed in the current arrangements, and therefore the need for a loss and damage finance facility, we feel that is an important step. And once we establish the facility, we'll be in a better position to identify exactly how it can look at the barriers and the issues that we would have been expressing in different ways in this room and external to this room, and be able to take those into account when designing what the facility will do to help the countries based on the various issues and needs that we have expressed. I think I will leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamaica. Colleagues, questions, clarifications on the facility, what Jamaica's proposal. Now is the time to ask in a nice, engaging way. Any questions on the facility? Any other suggestions or solutions? Do we have agreement on the facility? Yeah. Oh, I can't see. Okay, UNDRR, your contributions very much welcome.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. I'm Donna from the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and I've heard from several parties mention about the work of the UNDRR and how it complements the work around loss and damage. So I just want to put forth 3 points for consideration of the group. As you know, UNDRR's mandate is really to find ways to reduce and manage disaster risks. And what we're seeing on the ground is this, because of the climate impacts, disaster risks are really not just evolving, but really increasing through time. And so what we're seeing in our technical support to countries is that avert, minimize, and address are not actually, they are not sequential in nature. We are, the support that countries are at least requesting from the DRR community is that sometimes we start in addressing, then we avert and minimize. So it's no longer the sequence like in traditional disaster management that we reduce, prepare, and then respond, and then recover. So sometimes it's the other way around. So maybe looking at that kind of non-sequential thing, because in some countries, averting, minimizing, and addressing are happening at the same time. And then this is something that maybe we can, looking at it in that perspective, can add value in the discussion. Another point is that seeing avert, minimize, and address in a holistic way. We have this saying in the disaster risk reduction family that the best response is actually dependent on how you prepared and how you reduce risks. And so in addressing and recovering, it actually depends a lot on how the communities were able to assess the risks, take into consideration the science, the forecasts, the past and the future risk, etc. And in some countries, they even develop post-disaster recovery plans way ahead of the disasters. So the recovery plans are not happening after the impact happens. So really thinking way in advance and anticipating based on risk assessments and the forecasts is actually helping a lot of some of the countries who are experiencing these things. At least this is what we're seeing in the DRR side of things. What we are actually strongly suggesting is to really invest a lot in the risk assessment side of things, so we will be able to anticipate what would be the addressing part. And when this is really helping us, for example, and you do assessment and integrate that into plans, and then access funding because they are already integrated in. That kind of connection is helping a lot of our, at least a lot of countries and communities who are working in the DRR side of things. So learning a lot from the experience, decades of experience from the DRR community might be able to contribute in the discourse, in the loss and damage and in finding synergies and complementarities in the way we do things in the before, during, and after phases in the continuum of risk management and risk reduction. Not sure if that was clear, but happy to elaborate if needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contributions. Maybe I have one quick question. So very important points about it's not one way or the other. You know, it's iterative in different ways. But the question I think at hand is, so you mentioned more work on risk assessment. So the question I have is, where should this be done? UNFCCC? UNDRR? Yeah.
Okay, hard question, but on the ground, actually, what the countries are doing, in most countries, the DRR community and the disaster management community is more institutionalized in most countries. Some countries even just have, because it has been there, they've been responding to disasters. So on the ground, a lot of the assessment is happening at the disaster management agency side of things. And these are then complemented by the national Met offices. So I guess it's a country-to-country setting, so to speak. I don't have an answer on if it's just UNDRR or climate or UNFCCC, but again, they need to collaborate at the global, at the regional, national, and subnational levels. It's really impossible to separate these two because the disasters are getting stronger because of the climate impacts. And I think that narrative should really, really inform how we do the risk assessment and how we do the response, etc.
Thank you. Clarion call on the need to focus on risk assessment. It's there. A bit of question as to, we know the responsibility lies with national states. Issue still is about funding and who does it, but your point about collaboration is well noted. I apologize to Philippines. Philippines had actually wanted to mention something earlier, and I didn't acknowledge. So maybe I'll give the floor to Philippines, please. Is Philippines? Yeah. You wanted to raise a point earlier? No. No. Okay. So if not, we give it the floor to the European Union again.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Donna for her intervention. And I think it's spot on, and it's basically much of what I wanted to say, so I'll be brief. But I think, we were asked to reflect on lessons learned and what is effective and what can be scaled up. And I fully agree on the need to have a holistic approach, because that's the way to avoid fragmentation on the ground. And we've heard yesterday, we've heard today in the room, there are, many diverse and different hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And so, of course, no single actor or modality or initiative will be sufficient to cover the wide range of needs. So we just need to find a way to work in harmony, so to speak, between all of the communities of practice. And so I think a key aspect could be, bolstering cooperation and coordination. And another lessons learned, and sorry, I have 4 of these, but I'll be quick, is, again, the need to think about why are we all here in this room, and it is to focus on the most vulnerable communities and countries. So I think that should stay in the front of our minds. And then perhaps we should also try to promote, nationally owned and locally led and people-centered approaches. And I guess the 4th lessons learned would be, we could always try to foster innovative solutions. And that includes what also Mexico mentioned around maybe trying to find solutions that are better at responding to shock. How can we enhance shock responsive solutions in this architecture? And I know, Mr. Chair, that you wanted to merge also these two questions. So if I may also address the synergies and complementarity points. So I've talked about, bolstering coordination, and we've heard the need to have complementarities between what we do here and what UNDR does. But there are also other processes that we should talk about. Of course, Sendai framework, but we've heard yesterday about the importance of nature. So, there are also the Convention on Biological Diversity, but of course the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and so on and so forth. And we haven't mentioned it in this room so far, but I think that the Santiago network can be a key element in the equation to improve the coherence of action, because it will contribute also, to have a better overview of the evolving demands for the technical assistance that are relevant in this field. So again, the sooner we can operationalize it, the better. And yesterday we also heard from the G7 presidency, Germany, of the effort we're doing in terms of the global shield against climate risks. I think that's a very concrete example of an initiative that can improve the synergies and the funding arrangements that are relevant. But I also think we should perhaps welcome the UN Secretary General's plan to ensure that within the next 5 years, everyone on Earth is protected by early warning system. As you know, the EU is already committed to early warning systems. We are participating in cruise, in SOF, and just quickly, perhaps to go back on my innovative solutions point, you may have seen that Cruise recently launched a new sort of tool. It's called the Accelerated Support Window. And the idea is to support small-scale projects very quickly. So the idea is less than 2 months. So perhaps that's also something that we can look into. We also heard about displacement. The EU is taking over the chairpersonship of the Platform on Disaster Displacement in July 2022. So also something quite concrete that we could look into. And there are many other avenues, but just citing a few ideas. Thank you.
Any other suggestions, solutions, lessons learned that are useful for discussions? Bearing in mind the earlier gaps that we had raised. Nepal, thank you. Welcome your intervention.
Thank you. I think the previous discussion has clearly pointed out there is a lack of dedicated funding, and the procedures to obtain funds are quite complex and lengthy. So Nepal also has some bitter experience with regards to this statement. We have received funding from GCF, UNEP, for the National Adaptation Plan process. We have received 2 installments, and after second installment, the third installment was not released. So in Nepal, since last 6 months, we have not been able to do any further work on building Nepal's adaptation plan process. So I think as a way forward, Nepal believes that like adaptation fund, a loss and damage fund should be created under UNFCCC, and this should be additional to the existing funding mechanism, as many of the delegates have already pointed out. Second, I think technologies like early warning system and climate advisory services help, but they need to be built in a holistic manner. So why I'm saying this, because again, I want to refer back to one of the incidents that happened in Nepal last year. Nepal received more than 200 millimeters of rainfall in 24 hours, and that happened 1 month after the withdrawal of the monsoon. So it's very unpredictable. The climate is changing so rapidly that even if we have this system in place, and if we are not able to tell the farmers on time, then they may not, get benefit of these climate advisory services. So in the same case, what happened, the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology well informed that the rainfall will occur in next few days, but this message couldn't be communicated to the farmers properly. So now we have local government in Nepal, and this government is now 5 years. They have completed one cycle, but they are constrained by human capacity and the IT technology. So although the DHM had already predicted about this event, but it couldn't be communicated to the farmers, so 133,000 farmers were affected by this single phenomena. So what we believe, it should be complemented with proper training, and there should be a kind of technical backstopping, as well as there should be operation and maintenance fund, and I think the most important thing is that the messaging should have to be effective. So this is, I think capacity building is also required on risk modeling, as one of my delegates has already mentioned. But the challenge is how to make it understood by the local people. So this is very challenging, and integrate it into the local level planning process. So this is quite challenging. I think this is also one of the area where support is needed. I think one of the mechanism as a way forward could be the cross-country sharing of information and learning. For example, if Nepal can receive information about the gulf that is developing on the north side of my country, which is China, then we could have, minimize the damage that could have occurred from the bursting of the temporary lake that has been created by, let's say, landslide. Similarly, the amount of rainfall that happens in Nepal, if we can communicate to India on time, it will help to manage the flooding issues. So I think this could be also a way forward, the cross-country sharing of information and learning between the countries. So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nopal, for joining in the dialogue and sharing your perspective on some of the things that we could do better, including sharing of information, technical assistance, and a dedicated funding for GCF, for loss and damage. I give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, and thank you for all the proposals so far on the way forward. So in our view, loss and damage, and I think we've discussed this already, is wider than the UNFCCC, and I think the co-facilitator asked the question of where this should be done, and I think we align with what the EU says, and that we don't think that there's one single facility that will be able to address all the needs on loss and damage, because we think it's simply too big. There's a few examples out there of processes or initiatives that are trying to have a more coordinated approach. Mentioning the Santiago network, and I know it's probably not even close to the scale, but it's just an example of how, and it's being set up right now, how we're going to use, build on the work that organization, bodies, networks, and experts are already doing, and try to have a more coordinated approach in that case for catalyzing technical assistance. I think the G7 proposal from Germany on the global shield against climate risk for climate and disaster risk finance insurance is another example of better coordination in that case for climate risk. And going forward, I think as Canada, what we would like to put on the table is that we're really interested in exploring ways to have a more coherence across the UN system. So maybe this is a bigger issue than the UNFCCC. I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss it in the UNFCCC. We should absolutely discuss it, but I think we'll need to potentially elevate it. have like a full picture of how the UNFCCC interacts with other UN entities, but I think it's really important that we explore that. And the other thing that we should also explore is this way we can provide supports for the activities that are not currently being funded in the loss and damage space. But I think it's very important that we build on what is already existing. So I'll stop there. But yeah, very interesting to hear everybody's proposal.
Thank you, Canada. We have Colombia.
Thank you, co-facilitator. Just a brief intervention because we would like to react on the comments made by UNDRR. We just want to highlight that we had the opportunity to attend the workshop on the Santiago Network and any other fora related to risk reduction. And we heard from members from UNDRR highlighting that in terms of national disaster risk reduction strategies are often informed by historical observed losses rather than future projections. And for example, in terms of SOE are often outside the national disaster risk reduction strategies. So for us, it's clear that even in UNDRR, there's still some, some gaps that we need to work on it, and we just want to reflect on it because even if they are working and we appreciate the work done in terms of this, we see that still still the need to work more on losses and damages. They are just focusing in historical observed losses rather than the future projections, which is key for developing countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colombia, reminding us again of different priorities and focus. Japan, thank you for joining the debate as well.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I think this dialogue having a constructive discussion right now. Japan believes we need to deepen its understanding of the synergies and complementaries between efforts to avert, minimize, and addressing loss and damages, and those related to adaptation, disaster prevention, humanitarian assistance, and disaster risk financing, development, and etc., taking into account the results and the lessons learned from past practices. On top of that, the impact of support should be increased by implementing various initiatives in an integrated and coordinated manner, rather than by implementing each initiatives individually. Related to this, Japan has a couple of experiences to share with. Firstly, as the host country of the third Union Conference on Disaster Reduction, UNDRR. Actually, in 2015, Japan has committed to promote the Sendai framework, as the Sendai is a Japanese city's name, as you know, for the disaster reduction, which includes efforts in disaster risk financing, in addition to supporting capacity building and infrastructure development that contributes to disaster reduction for developing countries. One example of this is the disaster risk financing that is provided to developing countries in response to disasters. Another example I want to share is that the provision of a mechanism for countries vulnerable to disasters to agree on a loan support for framework and the use of funds prior to the occurrences of disaster, and remotely provide funds upon request from the borrowing country when the disaster occurs. In addition, JBIC, a Japan Bank for International Cooperation, has been actively involved in disaster risk financing in neighbor countries, as maybe somebody knows, and such as by playing a leading role in the establishment of disaster risk insurance in the Asian Pacific region. Also, in the case developing countries affected by natural disasters, the JBIC also provides various typical types of humanitarian assistance in response to the damage caused by disasters. So Japan would like to use these experiences to contribute to the constructive discussion on how to address loss and damages. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan, which reconfirms some of the earlier discussion that where immediate disaster strike, there seem to be some mechanisms in place. We haven't yet dealt with the issue, the gaps that was raised earlier. What happens when you move to the post-construction, longer-term phase? But thank you for your contribution. It adds to the solution, the toolbox that we need to address this very wide challenge. I give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you. And this time I didn't take the floor at the beginning to break the ice because I did want to listen different perspectives. We don't have a silver bullet. I think this is a very complex issue. But we do see the value of bringing together all of these different initiatives and have a better coordinated approach. I mean, we recognize that there's more happening beyond the scope of the UNFCCC, but we do believe that we need a mandate from the UNFCCC to address specifically loss and damage and to coordinate across all UN agencies and have those very needed synergies. I mean, we know that within the UN system there has been even a reform because what we have been perceiving, and not just in this convention, but in all of the UN universe, is that we're not talking amongst each other. We're not talking among conventions. We're not talking about UN agencies. And I'm sure it happens in your countries. We even don't talk within ministries and with other ministries and so on. So we definitely need a coordination entity. And I think that's extremely important because there's this diverse type of initiatives going on and that go well beyond even the UN agencies and universe. But if there's no one who's sort of bringing all of that information together and sort of making sure that we know all of the scope of what is available, then it's harder when we're already having the impacts to sort of look for a solution. So I do believe that we need a mandate to have that coordination and to make sure that we have those synergies and understand all of that scope. Then on addressing loss and damage per se, it's very constructive that we are now having this very important dialogue because from the views that have been expressed for the past 2 hours, it seems like we're just getting to understand each other. I mean, we've had now to explain why humanitarian assistance is not enough, why there's more than humanitarian assistance, what's the reality we're facing, and maybe there's some countries that fortunately haven't yet experienced loss and damage, but we're all going that path. We're not solving that climate crisis anytime soon. So it won't be just now a developing problem issue, it will be pretty much the whole world who will be affected by it. And we will all have to deal with the consequences and with, unfortunately, the losses and damages that are forsaken if we don't act soon. And so we do need to create, I don't know what it is, I don't know if new fund, a new facility, or with existing ones. I don't know what the best solution is, but we do need something specifically for loss and damage. And I do believe that the UNFCCC is a space to have a mandate to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. Camila, very useful comments. Can I pass the floor to Honduras? So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. I'm sorry I wasn't here before, but I'm glad I'm here now. I think I'd also like to add to the point where you just raised on the financing gap between the initial humanitarian aid and then the need for financing for reconstruction after disaster events. I think we can all agree that, as developing countries, we are the most highly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and vulnerable communities in every single country and population in every single country are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But speaking as a Honduran, and some of you might have heard this story in a previous intervention I made today, but loss and damage is a very important and urgent priority for us. In 17 of the latest German Watch indexes, Honduras has consistently been recognized in the top 3 most affected and vulnerable countries in the world. In November of 2020, Honduras was hit by 2 hurricanes, 2 Category 5 hurricanes, 2 weeks apart. So our country, more than 40% of our population was directly or indirectly affected by these events. And a country and a population that already was hit in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the aftermath of these events, the economic impact to our country was estimated to be at around $2.17 billion, of which 44% of those were damages and 52% of that were losses. And this represented around 10% of our GDP in 2020. So after the events, humanitarian aid was quick to come, and this came from many different countries from all around the world, developed and developing included. And the initial aid was estimated to be at around $30.1 million, and the country was obviously extremely grateful for that. But the next stage was reconstruction. And that's where things get tricky. The country was obviously, from years past, submerged in high levels of debt. And then we added the pandemic to that same year, 2020. And, the burden of debt was exacerbated. And then we get hit by these 2 hurricanes. So at the time, the government at the time elaborated a plan for reconstruction and sustainable development, which included an initial evaluation of the different projects, programs, and investments necessary for the reconstruction and building back better and more sustainably after these events. Getting the financing to flow, that's where things get tricky. The government knocked on several doors, and well, it's been 2 years now, and still we have a lot of effects and damages that we're still trying to recover from. And there's no financing flowing to this. So what are the lessons learned from this experience? I guess loss and damage is related, to climate change is not necessarily mainstreamed as a government priority for our countries, dealing with many different aspects that are sometimes have to be dealt with urgently. So more coordination and synergies are needed with other ministries, other countries, and even at an international, national and subnational authorities, civil society and grassroots organizations to help channel funds and how to mainstream response to loss and damage to make it more mainstream. Our countries do not have the methodologies or capacities to estimate the needs related to loss and damage necessarily, so we must rely on international and regional organizations to do this. We have still not been able to access financing to support the entirety of this plan. The country does not have enough fiscal space to finance this by ourselves. And the other point is, when we talk about scale, there is no available financing options to address this at the scale proportional to the effects that these disasters like these 2 hurricanes had on our GDP. There is, $2.17 billion in 2 weeks erased. So we need the facilities, and we need the channels, the mechanisms to have this financing flow for loss and damage. So there we have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honduras, for again reminding us about the specific challenges that countries like yours face, and how we need again to keep our eye on the ball, and how we try to address this in a spirit of solidarity and humanity. I give the floor to the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. I am reviewing the records of hazards and disasters in the Philippines, particularly the spate of typhoons that have come across our country in the last 10 years. And it states here that 3 of the biggest typhoons that have come to the country, in terms of magnitude and in terms of loss and damages, have been experienced in 2013, 2020, and 2021, respectively. That means 3 of the biggest typhoons that we experienced happened in the last decade. Meanwhile, records show that our climate response budget has also been increasing from 5% to 7% in the last 4 years or so. This indicates that while we are proactively engaging and taking on a number of initiatives to address our vulnerabilities in terms of disasters and climate, clearly it is not enough. While we are continue to avail of whatever risk financing instruments that are out there to protect us against events of different frequencies and severity, clearly the spate of typhoons in increasing magnitudes have decreased our ability to cope and to adapt. So therefore, Mr. Facilitator, we'd like to reiterate our position earlier, where we proposed that through the Glasgow dialogue, we will be able to reach an agreement to establish this facility, this funding facility dedicated for loss and damages. And this should be, of course, in addition to other risk transfer mechanisms, such as, but not limited to, the bonds, the parametric insurance, insurance and forecast-based financing, crop insurance, and some of these are actually already available, and we've already availed of this in numerous times in the various events that we have experienced. We envision that this release of this financing facility can be triggered by nationally determined thresholds based on the extent of the losses and damages and reliefs needed by affected areas of states. In the Philippines, a declaration of the state of calamity is triggered by a release of quick release fund to assist affected communities. In like manner, the proposed facility should cover the amount of loss and damages brought about by climate-induced slow onset and of course, extreme hazards events. Lastly, we'd like to reiterate that these funds should be predictable, stable, and easily accessible. Earlier, I might have not mentioned it, but with regards to the mechanisms that we found to be effective, we appeal that this mechanism should be be made efficient, be streamlined and simplified, and most importantly, that because time is of the essence, in order for these funds to be effectively utilized, unnecessary conditionality should be removed. That is all, Mr. Facilitator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippines. I don't see any more requests for the floor. We are 7 minutes to Japan. Japan, is there a legacy flag? Okay. Okay, that is, okay. We are 7 minutes ahead of time. In terms of solutions, I think on the one end, we have the suggestion of loss and damage, dedicated loss and damage financing facility. We heard a couple of delegations mention that. On the other end of the spectrum, I hear that there is a lot going on outside, and there is the point that we should try to leverage on all these resources to deal with the needs that were addressed. Somewhere in the middle, we have the suggestion of a coordinating entity, which I think, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have a common agreement that we need more coordination, we need more cooperation. Whether that coordinating entity plays that role, and of course, we also still have the Santiago network, as some have mentioned earlier, and whether that can morph into the coordinating entity. It's a question that we need to discuss as well. There's no common agreement here, and I'm not trying to forge a common agreement. I'm just laying out what I've heard so far. So there is two extremes. There is a coordinating entity in the middle. Who does what better? I think the other common point we need to acknowledge is that the scale of the problem means that we need all hands on deck from everywhere. So I think that is one common thread I think we all share. And then we have the solutions, which is the spectrum as I outlined before you. Of course, different parties have different preferences, but I will not say which prevails more over the other and just leave it as there. Is that an acceptable way to end at least this discussion for this question? And I hope the Secretary has took that down. So if not, I think I will close this session. I want to really thank all of you for obliging me in terms of engaging in a dialogue, putting aside partially some of your scripts, but still trying to address what the gaps are. And for me, maybe I'm stretching a little too far, but I think there was wide acknowledgement that the key gap is the addressing part of that tree mix. And the other thing I hear very strongly also is what happens, we need to do more on the post-recovery risk. And I've also heard, and I don't hear any disagreement, that some of the key issues that we need to get better grips on are key issues like non-economic losses and slow onset events. So we recognize that there is a lot of work, but these seem to be the key areas that we need to focus and work more on, which then leads me to Saturday's meeting. I have no idea what the SBI chair will instruct me as to how to, me and Christina, of course, how we would conduct that session. So I don't have much to share with you, except that on that day, we will have report backs from the different groups. So those of you who don't have colleagues in the other breakout groups, you will have an opportunity to hear if their discussions were as conducive, collegial, cooperative, and maybe I'm over-exaggerating the discussions here. The second part, which is an important part, is what do we do in the next 2 years? And how do we take forward the rich discussions that that has taken place here, the presentations and issues that were flagged in the plenary the day before, and how do we capture it and how do we take forward the work? So these are issues that we'll take up on Saturday, and I really hope that when we return to the plenary, we will continue to have this constructive discussion, and reminding all of you what the real focus is, and that is the people vulnerable people impacted in Honduras, Philippines, others, many of you, Jamaica, Maldives, have raised. Keep the eye on the ball on the vulnerable community. We are doing a lot, let's acknowledge that, but it's clearly there's more to be done, and how can we do better. So with that, we are 1 minute short. I'm sorry, I think I went on a spiel. So thank you so much, and we'll see each other on Saturday. And don't forget, for those who want a contact point, see, who was it? Canada or Switzerland? Canada. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.